Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night to all of you joining us from around the world. My name is Mark Ames, and I'm the founding director of a company called Strategic Cities, and we're your hosts for this webinar today. Thank you very much for joining us. We're really excited. It's great to see you all dropping in to the meeting and sharing where you're from. A big shout out. We've got people here from the United Kingdom, from Sweden, Luxembourg, Germany, Denmark, Norway, Australia, and even Leicester. So it's great to have you all here. I'm in Sydney, Australia, so it's past tea time where I am, and I'm coming to you today from the Gadigal lands of the Eora people, who are the First Nations custodians of where I am. Today, we are going to be having a really exciting discussion about navigating the politics of sustainable transport and looking and reflecting on a report by our speaker, James Gleave, which is entitled How to Make Friends and Influence Councillors. But before we get into that, I thought I would just share a little bit about why I think today is relevant. So just give me a second and I will share my screen. Famous last words, right? So I mentioned to you that we're your hosts today, Strategic Cities, and indeed that we are delighted to welcome you. We provide engagement and communication tools to help our cities to achieve particularly contentious urban change. And we do a lot of work around sustainable transport, public space, and development. In terms of the sort of work that we do, we provide embedded and emergency comms and engagement support, engagement training, engagement and communications advisory, as well as media monitoring. So you could say the theme of today's webinar is right up our street, pun intended. And as Strategic Cities, we believe that three elements always have to be present in order to enact change. We call this the triangle of change. And those three elements are money, a budget or an ability to pay for the desired change, knowledge, the ability to design or to imagine the desired change safely and well, and then political will. And that, of course, includes what you might call party political will, but also the will of the people, community sentiment, and how that sways decision makers. And without all three sides of the triangle being present, the triangle collapses and change is no longer possible. So when it comes to managing budgets and managing design knowledge, obviously there are clear education and experience pathways that we can pursue in order to learn about those things. But political will, community sentiment, and party politics is more of a dark art. Which is why when I saw James's research paper, I thought this is an excellent piece of study and something well worth some further discussion, which is why we're all here today. So before we get stuck into James's presentation, we're going to do a very quick poll using Mentimeter. That's the tool that you were using when you came into the room. And I'm going to share the screen with you now. I'm interested to know from you, from our audience, how confident are you engaging with elected officials like councillors, like politicians, like political leaders where you are? I'll just give you a few minutes to fill that one out. Fascinating to see your insights coming in. Quite a range of people there. All right. Well, James, to help set up your discussion, you can see from our audience, we've got quite an interesting split here. We asked, how confident are you engaging with elected officials like councillors? Only 3 of the audience have said highly confident, 10 have said somewhat confident. 3 of you are in the middle, but also on the other side of the equation, 10 people have said somewhat unconfident and 6 people have said highly unconfident. So very interesting reflection there, I think, of people's experience. And I guess that gives me the opportunity, James, to introduce you. So, as I mentioned, James Gleave is our keynote speaker today. He's in Bedfordshire in the United Kingdom, which is near London, and he's a transport planner by trade. He's more than 20 years experience in transport strategy, ranging from new mobility schemes right through to rail schemes. James is also a master's graduate of the University of Westminster and has a deep focus on community engagement and what he calls citizen-centred mobility. He writes extensively about transport planning, environmental policy, engagement and communications online, and also puts his words into practice with a really engaging social media presence as well. James is the founder and director of Mobility Lab and a board member of the Transport Planning Society in the United Kingdom. And perhaps more interestingly for today's purposes, James has also served as a town councillor in Bedfordshire. So he has first-hand knowledge of today's subject matter, and I'm delighted to host him today. During his presentation, you can all make comments in the chat or can ask questions using the Q&A function, which is at the top of your screen. And what I will do is we will have a live curated Q&A after James's presentation, and I will select the questions that attract the most interest. So yeah, please do ask your questions using the Q&A function at the top of the chat. Welcome, James. Thank you very much for your time and thank you very much for participating today. It's good to see you. I guess before you jump into the presentation, I have a very quick question for you. How did this piece of study come about?
Thank you very much, Mark. And obviously, well, good morning from the UK on this very warm morning. We're currently in our 4th heat wave of the summer, so if anybody comes denying climate change, you know, that's we're living proof of it. So that's a very interesting question, and it really came from 2 things for me. So firstly, I obviously have lived experience of being a councillor. Unlike a lot of other transport professionals, I've actually kind of seen how decisions are made from the other side, and obviously transport is very often it very often can be used as like a political issue, and politicians have a lot of say in terms of making the decisions. And also it's kind of in response to like a very common complaint which I've often heard amongst my peers around, if only kind of politicians made the decisions which we recommended are based upon evidence, you know, why on earth aren't they doing that? The evidence for sustainable transport is overwhelming. And I just kind of looked through the research on this and I thought, well, nobody's actually tried to answer this question. So I thought I'd try and give it a go with this research. So hence why it came about. I should also come state here that this research was also funded by from a grant from the Foundation of Integrated Transport, who tend to fund research on things like this. So I highly recommend their work. But yes.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. Well, the floor is yours, and yeah, really looking forward to seeing your presentation and insights.
Thank you very much, Mark. And I am going to have to trust you, Mark, to say that this is visible to everybody.
Yes, it is.
Fantastic. Well, this is usually the part of the presentation where I introduce myself, but Mark's already done it. So obviously it's just for me to say, you know, hello to everybody. And what I'm going to do here today is I'm going to present the findings of my research on how to make friends and influence councillors. Now, the actual title of it is much more, slightly more banal than that, but this is ultimately what it's all about. It's about what influences councillor decision making when it comes to sustainable transport schemes. And as I mentioned previously, just a short moment ago, part of the reason why I did this was it was personal. And that's me. This was when I was a town councillor for my local town council of Flitwick in Bedfordshire. I was the chairman of the Planning Improvement Group, very grandiose title, and the vice chair of Business Improvement and Development Board, and the vice chairman of Personnel Committee as well. So very grandiose titles. I didn't manage to get a wear chain, unfortunately, that's I was exclusively for the mayor, but I have experience of being a town councillor, and I loved it. I loved all my 4 years of being a town councillor. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to continue it due to work commitments. And as anybody who has been a councillor will tell you, it is pretty much a full-time job. And when you're trying to do a full-time job to pay the mortgage as well as another full-time job, it is very difficult to do. And so whilst as a town council, we were not directly responsible for highways and transport, obviously we were still very interested in these issues in our local area. And so that was part of the reason why I actually did the research. And how we often think of councillors is something like this. No doubt some of you in the UK, present from the UK, will probably be laughing at this right now. This is something which Mark kind of reminded me earlier on, was something called Compo Face, where actually this was sourced from, all these were sourced from a old Tumblr blog called Glum Councillors, which is a very stereotypical picture of councillors, which are usually pointing at a hole, usually on a pavement or on a road or a piece of flooding, a load of rubbish which hasn't not been collected, and of course the mayor turning up in the chains to open a local business. That's very much a quite a funny and some might say quite somewhat cynical view of how councillors work. They kind of, in some respects, they kind of do it for themselves. They do it for do kind of a bit of publicity, and this is kind of very funny. But actually, my experience of being a councillor is that it's something which is taken very seriously, and the decisions which they make are, they're often not taken lightly, and the actual experience of being a councillor is very different to this. Although, obviously it's still very funny. Fortunately, I did not have a chance to get my glum councillor picture. That would have been embarrassing. Anyway, so as I mentioned, I thought, well, okay, let's explore what kind of influences councillors' decisions. I should state right now that if you're coming onto this presentation and you're kind of hoping for what's the one thing, the one method which will almost without fail get councillors to decide in favour of sustainable transport, in favour of walking, cycling, and public transport, unfortunately, you're going to come away from this presentation disappointed. What I'm actually going to do for you, however, is I'm going to set out what the kind of things which actually influences their decision making, and then you can almost kind of start to map out, well, okay, this is the ways by which I can start to influence local decision makers. Now, I should state right now that the context of my my research is in the UK, so it's obviously highly relevant to the UK situation. It's somewhat relevant to others, but obviously there are different political systems, different ways of making decisions, but there are variations. And so I did do a literature review and a series of interviews in 2024, and that was reflective of the general makeup of councils across England, Scotland, and Wales. So for those of you who are not familiar with the UK, a lot of the decisions relating to highways and to transport are undertaken by what are called the local highway authorities or the local transport authorities. Now, these can vary, but they are usually the county councils, they are the unitaries or the boroughs in London, but also they can be something called strategic authorities. Notable example being Transport for London, Transport for Greater Manchester, Transport, West Midlands Combined Authority, and a few others. Of course, there's a whole load of reorganisation going on at the moment. And so this was kind of the broad political spread of the people who I spoke to. I should state right now that a lot of my research, because my research was undertaken in 2024, the interviews did tend to, and the timing of them did tend to get disrupted by not one but two elections. First of all, we had a series of local elections in May. That meant, sorry, local elections in May, and then we had a general election in June. And so, or sorry, it's July actually, June, July anyway. And what that then meant is that councillors could not speak to anybody during the pre-election or PERDA period. And so that did kind of disrupt the research somewhat, but some useful insight out of it. So what did I find out through literally talking to councillors and also doing some of the research on the political economy of decisions? And the first finding is not shock. It's not shock, but it's actually a bit more nuanced. Public acceptability drives everything that they do. And you kind of expect that because, you know, obviously they've got to be voted in. They got to be voted in every 4 or 5 years, and they are very mindful as to what. But whereas people often think of it in terms of like reacting to a particular issue, maybe something to share on social media, what actually drives them is something called salience at election time. Namely, they are trying to get inside the mindset of voters and what they're actually going to be thinking about on polling day. And some of the research in voting behaviour, which has been undertaken on wider political issues, indicates that what people are thinking about on polling day is a major driver of how people vote. Obviously, there are things like, you know, party allegiances, what people can think about particular issues and the like. But it's literally what they think about on polling day is actually a real driver for how people vote. And politicians kind of instinctively know this, even if they don't know what the issue is going to be. It's also actually extremely hard for politicians to shift attitudes. And we find that often quite surprising. So, for example, people may look to the likes of, for example, Barack Obama. You know, there are very influential politicians, very kind of inspirational politicians to people, and they think, okay, politicians should be like that. But not all politicians are. In fact, it's very hard for politicians to shift attitudes. But what they can do is they can motivate their supporters to become more vocal and influence decision making in that area, in that way. But of course, you know, they're like most of us, they use traditional and social media to help to influence their understanding of salience of issues. You know, they do go on Facebook groups, they do go online, and they do use that as kind of like a sense check as to how how important different issues are. They don't do it solely, obviously, but they've obviously got to understand what are people talking about, what are people kind of not necessarily mad about, but what they care about, and they do that through social and traditional media. Again, not much of this is shocking. But one of the most interesting findings was quite how critical the relationship is between councillors and officers, and where I really focused my research were on what we call cabinet members for highways and for transport. And time and time again through this research, councillors mentioned that their relationship with officers is the most critical relationship that they have, because they value their officers as technical experts who they rely on to make decisions. So, for example, outside transport, not many councillors know details of social services, children's services, before they get elected. So they are heavily reliant on their technical experts in order to ensure that what they're doing is legal and also it follows best practice. But councillors themselves actually see themselves as like providing the strategic direction. They are providing the goal to work towards. And they also check and challenge their officers on public acceptability. And that's where they can see where their real critical role is in this relationship. And one of the things which came up quite strongly from feedback from councillors was that If officers were able to have this kind of greater knowledge of what could be seen as publicly acceptable, it would obviously help them in their roles much more. But they see that as a role as a councillor in order to provide that sense check to officers who do the technical work and obviously are incredibly knowledgeable in their areas. But they are also happy to act as champions for officer recommendations. Again, there was numerous examples where councillors were asked to support recommendations which they disagreed with politically. It doesn't reflect their party. It doesn't reflect their own personal beliefs on how things should be. But they are happy to act as champions if officers put forward a clear, logical, and evidence-based decision in order to be made. So again, that relationship, understanding that relationship there between the councillors and officers is really important, is really critical to understand, and certainly one of the key driving factors behind when councils are not performing to what they should be is actually that relationship between councillors and officers breaking down, and that can have some quite serious consequences. Now, what is common in the UK is we have called a cabinet system of decision making, whereby the collective decisions of whereby a lot of the main decisions affecting a council are made by a cabinet, usually of cabinet members for different service areas. Ultimately, the full council then has the final approval, but the cabinet is really critical, and the way which councillors see their cabinet is very important in terms of ensuring collective responsibility for shared outcomes. Namely, I think kind of councillors realise that it's very tough to act as a lone voice anywhere in terms of making a controversial decision, whether it's sustainable transport or otherwise. But if they have the support of their cabinet, that matters more than you care to think. It's really kind of critical, and it's very difficult to understand cabinet dynamics because some are very much directional in their formal leadership, others are much more collective decision making. But that is really important to give councillors a sense of security in making controversial decisions. And particularly on controversial decisions, they absolutely must be talked about early to enable councillors to come to a shared view on what to do. The very worst thing which any officer can do, and anyone coming on sustainable transport can do, is almost like land a controversial decision at the last minute. That is almost like one surefire way to ensure a decision goes against the way which you want it to. But there is also a wider sphere of influence on councillors and how they make decisions. So the way I tried to frame it is, obviously at the centre here you have the decision maker. They have their own beliefs, they have their own norms, they have their own behaviours, they have their own political views, obviously. And it's kind of quite, and I think for any campaigners out there, that is tackling those core beliefs is very challenging to do. But what they do is they are influenced by almost like an inner sphere of people. I mentioned their officers. I've also mentioned community leaders as well. So they talk to a lot of community leaders, whether it be business leaders, whether it be people in community groups, activist groups, anything like that, who they trust, and they trust their opinions, and they trust that they can trust their opinions on things, and act as confidants. And influencing through that way is very important. Obviously, they are influenced by public opinion as well as their fellow councillors and fellow politicians, obviously. Now, this is all very well and good, but what this is actually very important in understanding is that when you're trying to influence decision making, typically unless you have a really good relationship with the councillor already, it's very hard to get them to change their minds, or it's something which takes a long time. But what you can then do is you can then start to map out, well, okay, these are the different ways by which we can influence things in favour of sustainable transport. So, for example, in offices, you embed sustainable transport knowledge, and people, they then provide it as part of their expertise. For community leaders, it's not just about those community leaders influencing politicians, but also about those community leaders acting as champions for for sustainable transport initiatives which are put forward by councillors and supported by councillors. Even if they're not perfect, I have to absolutely say this. One of the things, again, something which came out from my interviews with councillors was that they were putting forward a good, if not, but not perfect, sustainable transport solution, like a new cycle track or something similar. And then it was opposed by community groups who they thought would support it. And I think, well, okay, let's not try and let the perfect be the enemy of the good here. But anyway. And then, of course, you can look to make sustainable transport issues much more salient at the election time. For example, through traditional media and through social media. But there are some things which, for professionals, which you can practically do. So, and this came directly from the words of councillors. So, a very important one which came out almost at the top was identifying how you can help councillors achieve their election manifesto commitments. Several years ago, there was a presentation which was linked to the London Reconnections blog, which was Transport for London's first briefing with Sadiq Khan, who was then the new mayor of London. And what it contained was a slide deck of essentially TfL saying, this is how we can achieve your election priorities. This is how we can achieve your fare cap on buses. This is how we can achieve your cycling plans. And here's what the impact is in terms of other areas of budget, for example. And it was really good example of like how you can actually go to people and go to elected officials and say, I can help you to achieve your election manifesto commit. It instills that area of trust. And I lost count of a number of councillors who said in their first meeting with council officers, they said the first thing which council officers said was, well, what are your priorities? And they then had to say to them, I just ran an election on what my priorities are. You should know them. Anyway. And you can also commission surveys to understand public opinion on sustainable travel and share the results with councillors as well. You should also establish some ground rules for the engagement. So I referred to earlier on around things like councillors saw themselves as like setting the strategic direction and officers acting as the technical experts. If you establish those kinds of ground rules early, it makes it for very positive engagement. You also need to understand that is a learning relationship as well. So both of you kind of still learning from one another. Officers are learning about political acceptability. And of course, councillors are learning about how highways work. And also, very critically, use clear language and explain things very simply. These are not subject matter experts. And so when people are then saying, well, okay, we could put in a ERTO in order to enable this change, they have no idea what it is. You've got to kind of speak their language a little bit. So that's kind of some of the things which you can practically do as officers. That's the summary of what I wanted to present. I also am encouraging you all to attend a transport unconference which I'm helping to organise called Mobility Camp, taking place in Cardiff this September. I understand from Australian colleagues that there's just recently been a transport camp, something very similar in Australia. So people are welcome from all parts of the world to attend Mobility Camp, and you can sign up here at the QR code. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James. Snaps for James from the audience. That was fantastic. While all of you think about some questions you might like to ask James, which you can pop into the Q&A space here in Teams, I just thought I'd share some of the notes that I took during that because I found that fascinating, and I hope you all did too. The concept of election time salience, this idea that sometimes the agenda that grabs the attention is literally the agenda on election day. I thought that was an amazing observation from your research, James. And also the importance of the council officer relationship. In my experience, sometimes that's a little bit combative, but I think you're right to point out that actually, particularly when councillors are new, there's a lot of learning that they have to do, and that they can also, if you are an officer, councillors can act as champions of your recommendations and help you to get things done. I thought that was a great insight as well. Rushing anything that's controversial equals almost guaranteed disaster. Absolutely, that's my experience too. And also the importance of officers being on board or being aware of agendas. I thought that was a great observation. James, loved your tips. Be clear on how you can help deliver an elected official's election commitments. It sounds simple, but actually I see lots of instances where public servants don't do that. And also establish ground rules for engagement. Don't leave it to subtext. Make sure you're very explicit about how you're going to communicate together. Amazing stuff, James. Thank you very, very much. There is a few questions here, some comments as well. Lucy down in Devon said, thank you very much. That was a fantastic presentation and very on point for their needs there as well. And Wendy, who's here in Australia, asked, what can we do as a community group? So James, you had that slide where you talked about kind of the sphere of influence. What are your tips for community groups?
My tips for community groups is that do not underestimate your power as community leaders, and you are able to influence councillors in that way. Now, obviously, where I approached my research from was very much slightly more focused, like on the professional side. One of the tips which I would say, which I would partly recommend, is that if you have councillors in your area who are generally kind of supportive of schemes, even if the schemes are not perfect, act as champions for those schemes, because those councillors will remember that and they will come to you and they will trust you in the future in order to kind of act as a champion. That's very kind of important. Now, obviously, there might be instances where that might not be the case, but again, it's still about positioning yourself as a voice of the community and being community leaders in that way. And do not underestimate your ability to influence other people within your community. So it's I'd say those are kind of the most important things which you could do.
Yeah, good stuff. Thanks, James. I have a curly question for you here from Daniel Eichmeyer. Daniel, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. He writes, in our city, we have broad political support for sustainable mobility at a strategic level. However, when it comes to individual street projects, this support often fades once local opposition emerges. For example, when parking spaces need to be removed. So, how can we prevent projects from being stalled by local resistance, and what communication strategies work best in those situations?
Okay, so I would say that others will probably be better placed than me in order to advise on specific communication strategies and how to do things. I'm not a communications expert, but
yeah, Daniel, you should call me.
Yeah, I wasn't going to say that much, but you said it for me. So there's a couple of things. So firstly, ensure that you have good quality evidence in order to back up your position that actually these kind of schemes are supported. You could, doing a survey, it doesn't mean you have to contact someone like YouGov and do spend lots of money on it. It can be something which can still be kind of statistically reliable, which you can do yourself, and you can then say, well, actually, we did this, and what we then actually found was these kind of things were popular. That's very powerful to get. Again, it's very powerful to councillors. and also again, it's just like positioning yourself as like a voice of the community and a community leader, which councillors can trust, which can take time and it can take a lot of effort to do, and it's probably something much more long term. But again, that's really impactful in terms of influencing councillors as well. I will obviously kind of say that there will be local resistance to any scheme. It just kind of comes with the territory, unfortunately. But do not underestimate the value also of just speaking up in favour. Very often councillors, when it comes to like particularly controversial, they will only hear from the people who are against it. Stand up in a public meeting, however really scary it is, I'd say, do you know what? I think this is a good thing, actually. This is a good thing which should be done. And that gives councillors confidence that it is actually supported out there rather than just opposed.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Some great insights. Absolutely. That firstly, negative responses to change are natural. They're actually part of the process. They're not the outcome. And you're right that medals are won by the people who turn up for the race. If you actually have voices saying, yes, we want this, they are as powerful as the voices which say, no, we don't want this. And it's more natural to say no than it is to say yes. So I agree. Don't underestimate the power of saying yes. We have a few more points. Andy in the beautiful British city of Leicester said, your tips were great, James. Thank you, particularly about officers. Officers often do not read or relate to political manifesto pledges. And campaigners often do not connect or relate to political representatives. It would appear that change requires a Venn diagram of all three overlapping. And I agree, that's a great observation, Andy. Devon, she says, what do we do, James, when elected members are massively opposed to policies due to their own self-interest? For example, protecting their own personal lifestyle choices because they live in the place that will be affected.
I entirely understand. I did mention, obviously, in my research that it is very difficult to get councillors themselves to shift their core beliefs and kind of their core norms. It's something which takes a lot of effort, takes a lot of time, and in terms of kind of the outside influences on them, effectively, unless you're like a really respected influence upon them, it's very difficult to change that core behavior. But what you can do is you can help to change the kind of the general conversation, like the general state of things come around them, so that can gradually gradually shift their views over time, and potentially could also result in them not being elected next time at the next election. So if you can go out and have conversations within your community, talk to other community leaders, talk to other people, kind of influence council decision making like that, and say, do you know what this town needs is needs like its high street to be much more beautiful. Perhaps we should like give a trial of removing cars, let's say for a Sunday afternoon or something, and sowing those seeds of like with people who you respect and are able to influence decision, you're able to influence in that way, is very powerful. Literally just go out and have conversations, even if you just think you're just talking to a like-minded person or a person who you know and can respect for ages. Never underestimate just the power of having that conversation. It might not change the world on its own, but it changes a little bit in the context around councillors. I unfortunately cannot, as someone who obviously has been a councillor previously, I know quite how stubborn they can be. So unfortunately, that's what happens when you deal with people.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to clarify, when you say go out and talk and have a conversation with someone, you are talking not about some digital post bags and digital campaigns here. You're talking about fronting up in person, face-to-face conversations and genuine in-person relationship building, right?
That genuinely has a transformation. That's much more of a transformational impact than a post on X or whatever it is, whatever it's called itself nowadays.
James, fantastic insights. Thank you very much. Any final comments or observations from you?
No, obviously I've previously mentioned Mobility Camp, which I encourage people to sign up for. What I'll also do is I'll push the link into the chat of where my reports can be found, and it can be downloaded for free as well. So feel free to kind of go and have a look. Very much, but yeah, been great to speak to you all.
Fantastic. Well, before everybody goes, it's our turn to plug something too. But before we do that, James, thank you very much again for your time and for your insights. And thank you all for attending online. Before we leave, if I can get my computer to work, I wanted to share with you a quick plug with a program which is very relevant to the discussion we've been having today. I'd like to introduce you to a new leadership program from the Urban Cycling Institute in Amsterdam, which I'll be leading. Around the world, efforts to create safer, healthier, and more livable streets are running into resistance, like community opposition, political pushback, and media storms, which can derail even the best laid plans. And this resistance is indeed a defined problem. We see it happening in the same way around the world, but most practitioners, whether they're campaigners, officers, or politicians, have received no training or education on how to handle it, which is why we've co-created this new course with the Urban Cycling Institute. Let me show you a little bit more about that now. Across the world, efforts to make streets safer, healthier, and more livable are running into resistance. Community backlash, political pressure, and media confusion can derail even your best planned projects. The way you talk about your work is more important than ever. That's why we created Engaging Communities for Changing Streets, a 5-day leadership program in Amsterdam for people like you who are working on the front lines of urban change. You will explore Amsterdam's story of resistance to change and its transformation. You'll learn how to navigate resistance, build trust, and test new engagement tools from all around the world. Join a global network of change makers at the Urban Cycling Institute. You'll gain new skills, fresh confidence, and practical tools to take back to your city. Spaces are limited, so sign up now to transform conversations, transform streets, and transform cities. Okay, so that's the plug. Thank you very much for your patience with that. That course is taking place in Amsterdam next April, and the early bird rate closes at the end of next month. So if this is something that you're interested in, please do jump on the QR code and register RSVP because places are limited. Okay, well, if I can just get the screen to come up. That's all we have time for today. All that's left for me today is to let you know that you'll receive a follow-up email with a recording of this webinar, links to some of the resources that have been mentioned, and that's it. Thank you very much for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks so much, everyone. Bye-bye.